Irreversible was directed by Gaspar Noé and it came out in 2002. Who is Gaspar Noé? I'm here to tell you, along with Myroslava. But if you already know who he is, you already know he's considered possibly, was he the bad boy of art house cinema, would you say?
Uh, he's certainly a very polarizing director. He's solely responsible for some of the most disturbing scenes in art house cinema. And I feel like with most critics, they either laud him or they loathe him. And he has been accused of being quite kind of gimmicky, but at the same time, I think that his films are extremely moving, very well put together, and they have extraordinary depth to them. And in so many ways, he's sort of the epitome of the auteur because he creates with his films a consistent universe. And even we'll see in Irreversible that one of the characters from two of his earlier films, Carne and I Stand Alone, the butcher, makes an appearance at the beginning of Irreversible, just to kind of remind you that you are very much in Gaspar Noé's universe. And yeah, he sort of takes on quite difficult themes, themes of loss, of violence, including sexual violence, death. That seems to be another recurring theme.
The death of love.
The death of love, that's true. Also, intoxication. There's certainly a kind of a psychedelic dimension to his films, certainly his later films. To me, he is a director who harnesses the visual means of contemporary cinema, including digital editing, to show you something you would not otherwise see. So he's very much a pioneer. And yes, that does mean that he is very often pushing the boundaries. You were telling me earlier about the fact that he's associated with the new French extreme cinema. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so New French Extreme Cinema or New French Extremity, which is kind of what I would call it, is something that I'm going to go into in a bit more detail the next episode, because I'm going to be talking about another film from France that's tied to New French Extremity, but in a slightly different way. The term New French Extremity actually was coined by a critic called James Quant, and like film noir, there isn't like sort of it's not like action films, for example, or comedies or horror films where it's a genre. It's films that are tied together by themes, I guess, and they're all kind of transgressive films, all made in France or French speaking countries in the late 90s and kind of the first half of the 2000s for the most part. Now, Gaspar Noé is kind of most closely associated with the movement, but you also have directors like Francois Ozon, Catherine Breillat, Bruno Dumont, Claire Denis, Trouble Every Day, Marina Devan's In My Skin, Leos Karras' Polar X, and films by Alexandre Aja, so High Tension, Haute Tension, and also, well, quite an infamous film that I am actually quite tempted to cover on this channel. It's on Bas-moi as well. So it's all these films that came out in a sort of a similar period of time. And yeah, as I said, they're all kind of tied by these themes of transgression.
Also, Olivier Assayas. He's sort of another director who was kind of associated with the movement. Certainly, like his Demon Lover film kind of fits the bill, but he sort of evolved past it. Would you agree that Gaspar Noé, although associated with the movement, has kind of evolved past the movement?
To some extent, yeah, I would say he has. I would say his early films are quite nihilistic and quite misanthropic, and while his later films, they're not happy and optimistic films, although I think in a certain way some of them are. They're not as angry, but I guess that is a consequence of getting older. It seems to happen with a lot of artists, be it in film or be it in music, where their early work is sort of very angry because they want to rage against the world. It's like, fuck you, world, how dare you? And then, yeah, as they get older, they're, a bit more chilled out and stuff like that. And I think that is to a certain extent in Noé's films as well. But it's interesting we're talking about sort of Gaspar Noé's back catalogue, and it's definitely worth going through because I would say he's got a very consistent back catalogue, at least in his full-length films. I like most of his full-length films, bar one, which is still good, but it's not something that I'm happy to watch again. But we'll go into that in a second. So the first release that is of note is the short film Khan, which, as Myroslava already mentioned, is about a butcher and essentially his life and his relationship with his daughter and things of that nature. What were your thoughts on Khan?
I really enjoyed it. I thought that it does merit being seen alongside I Stand Alone, which is essentially part two. I found it very moving. I found it very different to his later films, which I was more familiar with and I had seen multiple times. My first Gaspar Noé film would have been Enter the Void, which completely blew my mind. It was unlike anything that I had ever seen. So to me, Noé was always associated with a sort of kind of psychedelic high cinema and, you know, really inventive camera work, lots of digital editing and sort of quite fantastical scenes. Whereas Khan and I Stand Alone has a very deadpan, almost documentary quality. And yet I think there's definitely a common thread, a baseline. Which sort of, that probably would be showing people at their rawest when facing quite extreme situations.
Yeah, and as Murray's already said, it was followed by a sequel of sorts, although it's kind of the weirdest sort of sequel in film history because you've got essentially the first part of the story and then I Stand Alone, which I've got to be honest, I can't hear that translation without going, stand alone. That's all I can think of, unfortunately, because I mean, as you probably tell by me going through all these lovely French directors, I don't speak French, so I've got a very kind of English kind of way of saying French names, so I'm not even going to attempt to tell you the French title.
Was that Godsmack?
Yeah, it's Godsmack. Yeah. So yeah, as you can hear, French is it's not a language that I speak, so it would be just me doing kind of weird French accents, I guess. But that is the follow-up to Khan, and it takes the story of the butcher. So in Khan, it's essentially the story of the butcher and his relationship to his daughter, how he ended up in prison because he thought a guy raped his daughter and he beat up the wrong man. He ended up going to prison. He lost his butcher shop, which seems to fuck him over in sort of quite a lot of ways. And at the start of I Stand Alone, he's this very angry man. Like, literally, the first half of this film is, I think, the most misanthropic film possibly I've ever seen. I mean, is that something you would agree with? Or
I think it's definitely one of the most nihilistic, misanthropic films that I've seen. It almost feels like a Celine novel that has been brought to the screen, you know, like Death on the Installment Plan and stuff like that. At the same time, the editing reminded me of Amelie and Delicatessen. You know, it really has that kind of quirky French early 2000s, you know, collages, voiceovers, slideshows showing kind of photographs of the butcher from childhood to the present day. You know, that kind of thing that sort of made me smile. It was kind of quite disconcerting. It's like the anti-Amelie.
yeah, I'm sure Gaspar would be absolutely delighted that you've just compared his film to Amelie.
I don't think he would mind.
I don't think he'd mind that much. He's probably a big softie at heart, isn't he?
Well,
I can imagine.
I actually, as you know, I met him when he was in Kiev for the premiere of Love. And that could be one of the reasons why actually I have a soft spot for Love, even though everybody pans it. But, you know, there's nothing quite like watching Love in 3D on the big screen, having just met Gaspar Noé. Um, yeah, and he's extremely polite, extremely laid back, very kind, very kind of considered, very humble. He's the sort of guy, like watching his films, you would think that he's this sort of larger than life, obnoxious character. And certainly there's enough kind of self-effacement and kind of self-irony in his films, the way he kind of presents filmmakers and especially like young filmmakers, the main character in Love. And then quite recently, Lux Eterna, which we just watched, the 2019 kind of mockumentary or pseudo documentary film that kind of takes a very, a harsh light to the modern film industry, but actually, yeah, I found him very humble and very sort of. I told him that Enter the Void was a very important film for me, and I really thought it was a work of genius. And he was like, "Oh, I don't know about that. One always has this image of what a film." Is meant to look like in your head, and then you're just left with whatever it is that you've made, So setting himself quite high goals, I think, and succeeding in wowing us along the way.
Yeah, I can't say I've met Gaspar Noé, but he was at the showing of Climax at Fright Fest that I was at in 2018. And he seemed like a sort of, quite nice, quite softly spoken kind of guy. He was trying to get them to turn the sound system up as like loud as humanly possible to deafen everyone, which is hilarious. He's got a bit of a reputation, I think, as a bit of a prankster. Because believe it or not, on the Mint configuration, or if you go on our YouTube channel, I think the most watched video on that channel is us talking about Climax. And it's quite interesting going back to it because I'm, absolutely loving it. I'm raving about it, telling everyone how great it is. And Rhea was like, it's all right. And Tom Tennant Cook wasn't that. I think he was slightly impressed, but it's not really. And the other Tom hadn't seen it. So yeah, it's quite amusing going back to it. But yeah, at that point it was, if you're going to see a film like Climax or indeed Irreversible or even Enter the Void, I think seeing it on as big a screen as possible with the loudest sound system imaginable is the way to see it. In terms of gimmickry, because one of the things, as you mentioned, Gaspar Noé is known for is kind of the use of gimmickry in his films. I Stand Alone is the first film of his with a gimmick, which is stolen from William Castle in a lot of ways. Because near the end of the film, it's probably about 25 minutes, 30 minutes from the end of the film, he gives us a warning that some really fucked up shit is going to go down. And if you don't want to be upset, leave now. Turn the film off. And it gives you a countdown. I think it's 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Isn't it? So I thought that was quite interesting.
Another thing which really struck me is the fact that as early as Khan, he has these very characteristic intertitles using a particular font that he's known for.
Yes.
And just amazing. I mean, Khan is what, 1990? Something like that? 1990?
Yeah, 91.
91, yeah. And as early as 91, he has such such a definite vision. He kind of knows what he's trying to say, what he's trying to do. And he's sort of inserting these almost aphorisms into the film, and also playing around with the sequence. Like in many films, the titles don't come in the beginning, they kind of come midway through the film or at like random points in the film.
Yeah, he loves doing stuff like that. It's very, the thing with the titles is very Godard. Like, Godard loves doing shit like that. I think that's basically where he got that from. And also, he will, and this is something that people make fun of him for, I would say probably deservedly so, because it's quite a po-faced sort of pseudo-intellectualist thing to do, is he will have these cards that will come up with these short statements on, like, Irreversible is kind of the most well-known one, which is time destroys everything. But in Climax, for example, there's 3 of them that comes up where, I don't know, I can't remember exactly what they said, but yeah, it's these short kind of pithy kind of quotes. And he does it in Lux Eterna as well, where he's got these quotes from like Jean-Luc Godard or Fassbinder or
Carl
Dreyer.
Theodore Dreyer, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
so that's something that, again, he's very, very known for, as is wacky titles.
I think they're quite tongue-in-cheek as well, because was it was it an I Stand Alone or Con? Death opens no door. Just really sort of larger than life, sweeping statements, which in some ways are both contradicted by the action on the screen and confirmed. Certainly in the case of Irreversible, time destroys everything. It really is a narrative of unraveling told in reverse.
Absolutely. But yeah, as you've said, I Stand Alone is very different from all the films that he made afterwards. And that's probably because he had a different cinematographer. So all the films that he's made post I Stand Alone, the cinematographer is Benoit Debie, who is awesome. Like, all the kind of great cinematography in all of Noé's films comes from him. So all the floating camera movements. What I Stand Alone has is the amazing editing. So it's very kind of self-conscious editing where right in the middle of a scene, a character will talk and then there'll be, I don't know how to best describe it, but it's like there'll be like an orchestral note for like a second and then it will cut to the next shot, I guess.
It's almost like a shot, almost like a hole punch, like the sound like a hole punch makes when it's kind of bashing through paper. It's very kind of like and then like a very dramatic cut with like a slight zoom in almost.
Yeah, he does it sort of really, really well. His films are stylish, and I Stand Alone, even though the camera isn't floating in the air and kind of swirling overhead like in his later films do, but the camera work is still awesome. So you've got tracking shots, you've got these sort of very still shots on the main character because it's his story. And I could literally, like, all of Noé's films, I could do episodes based just on each one all together and I'd have enough material, believe me. That's how great I think these films are. But yeah, I just found the editing style very different in that compared to the rest of his films. And then after that we had Irreversible, which we are going to go into in a minute, so I'm not going to go into that too much now. After that, so Irreversible's 2002, we've already mentioned it. 2009 we got Into the Void. So as Miro said, it's the first Noé film that you saw and it had such a profound impact on you. Now, without wanting to cast any aspersions on you, Mrs., is that the circumstances of which you saw it, or was it the film itself? See how I've asked that?
I'd say it was a bit of both.
All right, okay.
I missed the Kiev premiere of Enter the Void, which I had an invitation to, because one of the radiators in my house exploded and it was sort of gushing.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was quite dramatic actually. I spent that evening sort of catching boiling water that was shooting out of a radiator into buckets with my mother in shifts. So I kind of always wanted to see this film, and it was
a sign from the universe. The universe didn't want you to watch it. Clearly.
No, it didn't. I think more correctly, it didn't want me to watch that film with my mother.
Right.
And in a way, like I'm quite sort of happy that we didn't go together, because she's exceptionally kind of squeamish and kind of weird about watching anything unpleasant on the screen. She really doesn't like, any kind of unpleasantness. And I didn't realize, I think, the extent of the challenge that watching this film presents. I think
right.
Noé's films they're a bit of a kind of physical and emotional ordeal, aren't they? Like, that watching a Noé film, it is going to demand of you a certain courage, a certain stamina, shall we say?
Yeah.
And certainly with Enter the Void, I did watch it I watched it in 2011 with a friend, and That was a film that I think that was the only film I've ever seen where I passed out at one point because it was just so much. And I've seen it many times since. I have it on DVD. We rewatched it before this. I've kind of seen it over the years. And there's something about it. I think the sheer length of it, when you get sort of to a midway point and it's sort of like slightly lost you a little bit. You're so exhausted. It's kind of bringing you into another state of mind. And then it kind of brings you back out of it and kind of sort of, takes you all the way to the end. And having seen it every single time, you feel like, whoa, like what the hell was that? And I think it's no coincidence, because if you think about the sort of films that Noé tells us he likes, and he's quite good at both at auto citation and at putting in these little, clues in his own films about films that he likes. Certainly in Irreversible, we see a great big poster of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the one that says "The Ultimate Trip." So in a way, I feel like
doing that.
He does. I feel like Enter the Void is his homage to 2001, and that in itself is the ultimate trip. For me, I'd say that's the trippiest film that I've ever seen, alongside Altered States by Ken Russell. I mean, to me, they almost form like a kind of informal psychedelic trilogy. 2001: A Space Odyssey, followed by Ken Russell's Altered States, followed by Gaspar Noé's Enter the Void.
Wow. I think if you watched Altered States, I don't know, that sounds quite scary to me. It's not quite the same. The other two I can understand, but yeah, Altered States, no, I wouldn't want to watch that under the influence, shall we say.
Nuh-uh.
No way. But yeah, if you haven't seen Enter the Void, I recommend it as well. I mean, basically, I think the first 5 or 10 minutes are on YouTube. So if you want to kind of know what you're getting yourself into, then it has the opening credits, which are awesome, but maybe not suitable for people with epilepsy. Because one of the things I would say about Noé, and I'm going to go into this later on, is if you're with someone who's epileptic, Noé is the worst director of all time, because it's like he's trying to kill you, so yeah, just bear that in mind. But the titles are awesome, and the film is mostly from a first person perspective, almost like a video game, but you are basically in the main character's head, and he takes DMT, and then you see kind of what taking a DMT trip would be like, and apparently it's meant to be quite accurate to what it is actually like. I'm not, Joe Rogan. I've not done DMT, but yeah.
So Gaspar Noé took DMT once or twice as research for this film.
As research, in inverted commas.
As research. Well, I think it really was research for the film. So I think it was intentional, to try and convey that experience as accurately as possible. I have not taken DMT, but I have heard from people who have that indeed it is quite an accurate...
I wonder who those people are.
Yeah, that is quite an accurate representation of what a DMT trip looks like. Interestingly enough, your body actually produces DMT in very small quantities. That is one of the drugs that is responsible for inducing dream vision. So it's quite a metaphysical, exploration, and it sort of toys around with the idea of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and reincarnation, and it shows the main character's spirit leaving his body at the point of death and sort of traveling around from above, looking at his life from above, trying to find another door through which to enter this mortal coil.
Yes, and he finds one in the end not to give too many spoilers for Enter the Void, it's not really a film you can spoil as such, but his best friend, who loves talking about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, essentially has sex with his sister, and he impregnates her, and you can see, well, you've got basically CGI intercourse essentially going on right in front of your eyes, and sort of CGI sperm coming out, which is quite apropos because the next full-length film he made was Love in 2015, which is was promoted as a 3D sex film essentially. So this was like a midnight showing at the Cannes Film Festival, and yeah, this is when 3D was sort of still a thing, although it never really took off that much after kind of the first half of the 2010s. And I would say of all his full-length films, this is kind of my least favorite. It's not that it's a bad film; it's good, but I prefer his others. And yeah, it's got a lot of kind of nudity, and it's got a lot of unsimulated sex scenes, like kind of Nine Songs by Michael Winterbottom. I don't know
Oh
if you've heard of that
goodness.
film.
I have seen that film, believe it or not.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was one of my rentals on Love Film back in the late 2000s.
Wow. God, I wonder what they must have thought of you, like, you know, renting something like that. But yeah, it's essentially his version of that film, I think.
Well, he said that he set out to make a sentimental film about love and sex, and I think that's what he has done. It's a film I think that we're bound to compare to his other films, which are standout masterpieces. Love is not a masterpiece, but it's nonetheless a very enjoyable film. I found that I enjoyed it much more rewatching it, and not sort of having very high expectations in a way, just kind of enjoying it for the visual feast that it is.
Yeah, yeah, because even though it's not really the sort of story that kind of justifies having like huge sweeping camera movements, the composition of the shots is still really good. I really like sort of the framing in the film. It's the most consciously autobiographical film, I would say, of all his films, because the main character apparently is it meant to be Gaspar Noé? I don't think in
I
real
think
life.
he's denied that it's autobiographical.
Right. Well,
Um,
it's a film director,
sure, but then,
so
yeah, I mean, I see what you mean. I don't think it's necessarily supposed to be autobiographical more than self-referential. I mean, he takes that
right.
kind of autocitation to the extreme, by naming everyone in the film after himself in one way or
Yeah.
another, naming, the child of the main character Gaspar for no reason,
Yeah.
and and stuff like that. So that's actually, I mean, Love was originally conceived, see what I did there, as a film
Mm,
called Danger. And it was a script that he had written before Irreversible, even. And he actually meant for Vincent Cassel and Monica Bellucci to star in this film called Danger, which was never made. They thought it was too much, too kind of full on, and they didn't want to do it. But then he kind of ran Irreversible by them. The script of Irreversible had all of 3 pages to it initially. Danger had 5 or 6 pages. They decided to fly with Irreversible. And Danger never got made like it was originally designed. And he came back to the idea, having made Irreversible and Enter the Void, and having a little bit more funding to kind of experiment with the composition, with the lenses and everything. And he even got a grant to use 3D technology. So
wow.
yeah, I think it's something that comes from a place of experimentation as much from a place of sentimentality or autobiography.
Yeah, yeah. You are right though. It is very self-referential. So you've already mentioned the baby's name. He appears in the film as the ex-boyfriend of the main female character, Electra.
And his name is
Her
Noe, and he's a
His name
gallerist.
is Noe. Yeah, he's an art gallery owner. It's Gaspar Noe in a odd looking wig. I'll say that much. and all the main character has posters all over his walls of films that Gaspar Noé really likes.
And he has a model of the Love Hotel from Enter the Void from Tokyo.
Yes, true. So yeah.
And I think he has an opium stash in a VHS cassette of I Stand Alone.
He does, yes.
Which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah. So
he's certainly a
make
director.
Of that what you will.
He's certainly a director. He's a massive cinephile. And he sort of shares that enthusiasm with us.
Yes, although how he does it is very different from someone like Rob Zombie, for example. So Rob Zombie, he's watched a lot of films, and what he'll do is, in that way that kind of Tarantino does, he will have his characters have full-blown conversations about, oh, I don't know, so in one film, characters will say, oh, I'm, the Humphrey Bogart guy, and the other character go, well, no, I prefer James Cagney. James Cagney was better. And these people will have these conversations that don't add anything to the plot. They're just, I don't know, almost like showing off. They're kind of like, oh, I've watched some films type thing. Whereas Noé at least kind of does it in a much more subtle, it's not subtle. That's a terrible description of what he does. No, it's a lot more kind of, it's there if you want to look for it, if that makes sense. It's not intrinsic to the plot or the dialogue. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
There are some scenes, especially in the earlier films, where you can see directly where he's taken them from. Like, for instance, he really loves Taxi Driver. And that's a film that, for whatever reason, I watched and rewatched quite a lot in my teens and haven't seen for quite a long time and feel like rewatching now in context of this, of understanding Noé better. But there's a scene where the butcher goes to like a porn cinema in I Stand Alone, where he's sort of killing time, where he doesn't want to go back to his pregnant wife, which is very similar to the Taxi Driver universe. There's almost an identical scene where Travis goes to the porn cinemas of 70s New York quite a bit in that film, but and actually brings a date.
Yeah, he does. He actually has the great idea to bring Sybil Shepherd with him, like on his date to the porn cinema, which is not the best idea. Don't do that, everyone. That legit worst date movie ever territory there.
Yeah, but that's something that's like almost like a visual citation. But then something like Climax, which is one of his later films, is 2017 or 18?
2018.
2018. You would know because of Fright Fest, right?
Yeah.
There, he actually, the intro actually shows a VHS TV playing audition tapes surrounded by stacks of VHS cassettes and books where you can read the spines, and it tells you exactly what films Noé likes. So we've got Labyrinth Man, Zombie, Suspiria, Harakiri. We've got two Kenneth Anger films, the inauguration of the Pleasure Dome and Scorpio Rising, The Mother and the Whore, Possession, which is, another film that you could argue that the freak out scene in the tunnel is cited within Climax itself, when you have people like losing their shit when they're having a bad trip on LSD. Exactly. So certainly, sometimes it's subtle, other times it's right in your face, staring at you from the screen. Read the spine, watch the film, do it. Gaspar wants you to.
Yeah. So I already mentioned I saw Climax at Fright Fest, and I had a grand old time. Absolutely loved it. Climax is, everyone, without wanting to sound like a dick, I'm sorry, I apologise in advance if this makes me sound like an absolute tosser, but it's Fright Fest. You can imagine a lot of people there, they're just there to see, a zombie film, or, a film that's like 80 minutes long and half of it is like people getting killed, essentially. And then they get presented with this sort of French art house film where, the first 5 minutes uninterrupted is people talking on video on audition tapes, and then there's a long extended kind of dance sequence of like again about 5 minutes, which is awesome by the way. So good, so well choreographed. And then you've got characters talking essentially about their lives and wanting to have sex with different people, and then another dance sequence, and then you've got the main kind of story beat of the film, which is that the what is it? Is it sangria?
Yeah, sangria.
I thought so. My mind went blank for a second there, but yeah, like the sangria gets spiked by LSD, and then everyone starts tripping, and it's all cut really well. It's made to look like it's sort of one take. I don't know if it actually is. It probably isn't one take because God, that would take a lot of planning and stuff. But yeah, it's all edited together to make it look like it's one take, and yeah, it's definitely an experience, I would say. Although while some pretty messed up stuff happens, it's not as nihilistic as I Stand Alone, for
No,
example.
but according to Noe, it's a film about collective failure.
Okay.
And in many ways, that is what happens. We see kind of a microcosm, like a society just unraveling on the screen. Just, the basest instincts taking over, and all that is good and human and warm just completely disintegrating in the face of madness and chaos.
Yeah, because one of the things that is said in one of his intertitles that he brings up near the start of the film is like, this is a French film, and all the characters are sort of different races and different sexualities. You've got LGBTQ characters in there, and it's a wide spectrum of modern France. And so for him to then say that is quite interesting because he's clearly then making a comment about France itself.
Yeah, it was, I think, chimed quite well with the zeitgeist, and he was praised for including a vast array of body shapes and colours in this film. He's certainly got quite a varied paint box in this one.
Yes, very, very varied. For noobs, so if you're someone who's coming into this who's actually never seen a Gaspar Noé film, or you've not seen all of his work, I would say actually a good one to start off with is probably Climax, because
Agreed.
it's not too in your face, but you've got kind of all of the Noé-isms in there. And it's modern as well. So some people, they won't watch anything that's more than like 10 years old. So yeah, I would say start with that one. But really, all of his feature-length films are worth watching to me. I would say, yeah, Climax, Irreversible, Enter the Void, I Stand Alone. If you can watch all four of those, you're doing well.
Yeah, or if you want a shortcut to the Noé oeuvre, then a really great short film is a film called Voodoo, which was part of the 7 Days in Havana collection. Really, really nice film that uses all of Noé's stylistic tropes and delivers quite a story in under 10 minutes.
Cool. So if you want like Noé, but in a bite-sized chunk, that's kind of a good one to start off with. Definitely. So let's move on to Irreversible, which is why you guys are all here. I would say Irreversible, by the way, is probably not a good film to start off with for Gaspar Noé, unless you want to get into the most fucked up film straight away. Because, yeah, there's some really, really fucked up shit in this film, as we're going to go into. The synopsis, or indeed the story of Irreversible, I will give you very quickly. It's a rape revenge film. So there's a lot that kind of goes into that, and I'm going to talk about rape revenge films in a sec. You have a couple. It's Alex, played by Monica Bellucci, and Marcus, played by Vincent Cassel. They are out at a party with Pierre, who's played by Albert Dupontel, who is Alex's ex-boyfriend. They all kind of get on to a certain extent. There's a little bit of banter between Alex and Pierre, more from Pierre's end. A lot of needling from Pierre to Marcus for different reasons. Lots of talk about, like, sex. Like, the French are very open about kind of people having sex with each other and all that kind of stuff. It's all very, very strange to me as a repressed British person. Anyway. So anyway, Alex gets upset with Marcus at this party and she leaves. She ends up getting very horribly raped and beaten by a man in an underpass. And then obviously Marcus and Pierre find out about this. Marcus is very understandably upset by this and he wants vengeance. And then he finds out that someone called Latenya, the tapeworm, who's a pimp, could have been the one to carry out the rape. And he is found at the Rectum Club. And they go to the club, and then there's a very, very nasty incident involving a fire extinguisher that we're going to go into in a sec. Now, as I said, it's a rape revenge film. It's kind of a standard rape revenge narrative. This, if you've seen any rape revenge films, it's not really that different from a lot of them in many ways. But what this one does differently is this one is in reverse chronological order. So you see the revenge part first, and then the rape part is in the middle, and then the second half of the film is essentially all the stuff that would typically come at the start of the film when you're kind of getting to know the characters. So it's kind of interesting. So there are things that you find out in the course of the narrative. So the first thing I would say, and this is really, really fucked up, is that the ending, which if this played out the right way round, it would have a very, very downbeat ending. It would have a horrendously downbeat ending because, spoiler alert, everybody, the man who gets beaten nearly to death or to death with a fire extinguisher is not actually the person who carried out the rape. He is there in the club, but it's not him who gets this beating dished out to him with a fire extinguisher. It's actually some other random character who was wrong place at wrong time. So that's really messed up. But you also find out other things about the characters that would not be as apparent if the film was in the right order. So I don't know if you caught this, but before they go to the party, Pierre, who I don't like, by the way, I think Pierre is a massive shit in this film. Not just because he's called Pierre, but just he's just such a, I don't know, he's just a very kind of insecure guy. And he always rubbed me the wrong way. Even when I first watched this film back in the day, like in the 2000s, he always like, I don't know, there was just something about him that didn't feel sincere or genuine. I just thought he was just a bit of a prick character. He gives Marcus like some, I think it's ecstasy before they go to this party. So when he then starts sort of acting up at the party and he starts wanting to dance with everyone and do coke and all this kind of stuff, it's because Pierre's giving him this fucking ecstasy because he's trying to get back with Alex. So he's basically setting up Marcus. So what a dick. Anyway, so yeah, Mira, what are your thoughts on all that, what I've just said?
Well, Irreversible is another intellectual experiment that unfolds visually, but just like Enter the Void is based around the main idea of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is about the soul's journey between physical death and reincarnation. This film is sort of loosely based around the main idea of the J.W. Dunn book, An Experiment with Time. And this is the book that we see Monica Bellucci's character reading in a park in the final scene of the film, which chronologically would have been the opening of the film.
Yeah.
And she mentioned this book. She mentions this book to Marcus when they're getting ready for the party. And she mentions that she had a dream about being in a tunnel that breaks into two, which is a form of like precognitive dream, which sort of foreshadows that which is meant to happen to her later that night. Of course, we had already seen this on the screen.
Which is what makes it really, really fucked up, because we can see essentially into the future.
Yeah. And it's not really until almost the end of the film that we find out that she was actually pregnant. So the whole weight of the tragedy kind of comes crashing down on us, knowing that not only has a loving, beautiful woman been brutalized, and that's really irreversible in the sense that, the physical damage notwithstanding, that's something that really does change you for life and is likely to affect both her existing relationships and any relationships that she has in the future, but also that this rape almost definitely resulted in the death of this unborn child inside her. But the central idea of An Experiment with Time, which was a book which was quite influential at the time. It was published in the 1920s, and it was sort of part of the kind of surrealist movement in a way. It was picked up by the surrealists, and surrealism is something that Noé has openly admitted to being interested in. One of his favorite films is Un Chien Andalou, which is sort of the surrealist film par excellence. And the idea that this book proposed at the time was that precognitive visions are given to us to allow us to foresee future personal experiences, and that certain events occur again and again in our lives in order to give us a chance to alter ultimately the course of events. So the structure of the film, as well as these clues that are given to us within the film, can be seen as a sort of meditation on this theme, in the same way that the Tibetan Book of the Dead gives the narrative, but also the stylistic direction to Enter the Void.
Although what I would say is you don't have a character in this going, oh, I've read this book, you should read it too. It's great. It's about this. Like you getting Into the Void.
Oh gosh, but Alex does mention it. She mentions it to Marcus, and then she mentions it to Pierre and Marcus when they're on the underground.
Okay. I must have missed that.
Or when they're in the lift going into the building where the party is. But yeah, this is something that she refers to again and again. I'm completely with you on that, because actually the first time I watched Irreversible would have been in the early 2010s. So I was in my early 20s. I was studying French at university. And I was trying to watch as many films as I could in French, kind of without subtitles, without dubbing, to practice the language. And so when I first saw it, I watched it just completely with in French, without subtitles. I have to say, the film is quite self-explanatory, like you're not gonna misinterpret, what is happening. But I have to say, I must have gotten only about 50% of what was said. But the interesting thing is that virtually everything that we see spoken on the screen was improvised by the actors. Noé hadn't scripted this. So in fact, the actors were encouraged to have conversations, interpret the situations as they saw fit. And Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel at the time, they were married, and the scenes of intimacy between them, and the sort of like weird little conversations and kind of messing around between them, they do resound with this realism. They are extremely believable. Like you get a sense that you are seeing something, almost like looking into their private life as you're watching.
I got that feeling as well, actually. Like, that's one of the things, like, because we were talking about love, I think one of the things that Irreversible has over love is, one, the actors in Irreversible are better. They just are. So they were able to improvise the material better than the actors in Love, but also because, yeah, they are like a legit couple. They've been together for years,
And they've been in lots
you
of
know,
films together.
and they've been in many things. They're like the it couple of European cinema
Well, not
for many,
anymore.
many years. Well, at the time they were, for
At the time
sure.
they were. Yeah, absolutely.
I
Mr. and
think they
Mrs.
appeared
Smith.
in, yeah, yeah, definitely. They've been in at least 5 different films together. Like, so yeah. So anyway, they're used to being in films together. This is weird. You get this with actual real life couples when they appear in films. A lot of the time, they don't have any chemistry on screen. It's this weird phenomenon where, yeah, you can have like someone who obviously in real life you get along with famously, shall we say, but on screen you have like negative chemistry, whereas that's not the case here. No, they have really, really good chemistry.
Yeah, and they look very good together as well on the screen. Both believable, but just from an aesthetic viewpoint. And obviously, Noah is very aesthetically minded. I mean, he's been known to cast women that he's randomly seen out and about clubbing, in his films because they have a certain look about them. And in this case, one of the things that Noé mentioned at the press conference for Love in Kiev, which I attended, was the challenge that he felt working with a real life couple, namely Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel, when he was doing Irreversible. So when the 10-minute rape scene had been edited and put together, he invited Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel around his house to watch it because he kind of wanted to, to get their okay, so to speak. And
Right.
he was feeling exceptionally self-conscious showing that
Not
scene
surprised.
to Vincent Cassel and Monica Bellucci in the same room. And he was just kind of like, holding his breath the whole time. And then, when that was over, he just kind of like looked over to them and kind of was almost expecting Vincent Cassel to like beat him up or something. And they were both really pumped, going like, oh yeah, that looked incredible, So very much a cinematic couple that lived for cinema at the time, who were completely able to, distance themselves from what was happening, as professional actors, but to bring intimacy and the chemistry that existed between them at the time onto the screen. So a rare flower, in other words.
Yeah, yeah. Although that's interesting that you say that was the reaction that they had, because that was not the reaction that people had at the Cannes Film Festival when this film premiered. So I refer to a review because obviously I wasn't really watching films at the time, so Cannes wasn't something that I was really paying a lot of attention to in 2002. So I refer to this review, which is actually on Letterboxd by Mike D'Angelo, who was writing for Time Out New York at the time. And he mentions, for example, in this review, I'm not going to quote it because it's quite a long review, but essentially he was talking about how literally in the first half of this film, literally half the audience walked out of it, that people were legitimately furious. Apparently, this isn't mentioned here, but I remember reading something to the effect of like it was Vincent Cassel's brother or something was in the audience at the screening at Cannes, and he openly sort of said he wanted to beat Gaspar Noé up for like making this film or something, or like, yeah, for putting his brother's other half in this position, showing her getting violently raped for like 10 minutes. So yeah, people were fucking pissed off at this film at the time, which
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just what was happening on the screen. It was also the sound. So the sound design was particularly unsettling, and a lot of people found the kind of the low whirring, almost like womb-like sound really difficult to bear.
Yes, which is deliberate on Noé's part. He did that on purpose. It's not like some accident where he made the film kind of difficult for some people to watch. No, he put that in there deliberately, everybody.
I'm pretty sure
It's the kind of
everything
guy we're
he
dealing
does
with.
is done deliberately. All the sensual affront on Gaspar Noé's part is completely calculated.
Yeah, him and because at the start of this podcast I mentioned how he's the bad boy of kind of French cinema, and I would say him and Lars von Trier are kind of both the enfant terrible, should we say, of kind of European art house cinema. Sort of they're both the bad boys. Although I would say Noe is kind of a bit different to von Trier. I would say Noe's a bit less. I don't know. He doesn't necessarily do the whole press conference gimmickry. Like he's not compared himself to Hitler at the press conference yet. So he's Von Trier's got that one over him. Like he's not said like ridiculous stuff to the press, as far as I'm aware of, anyway. But yeah, and I would say that that's an interesting point that you bring up, because a lot of the negative reviews of the film, they talk about things like how, obviously people talk about the rape scene and how it upsets them. And I you know what, I can understand that. That's perfectly reasonable to get upset by the rape scene. But Marcus uses a lot of slurs, like, so there's a lot of content in there which could be, and perhaps you can understand, would be called homophobic. There's definitely a couple of scenes that are questionably a bit racist, and there's other scenes that are, well, there's one scene that's kind of transphobic, but I would say that that's not like a malicious thing on Noe's part. He's just kind of showing this character who's become so debased that they almost don't care what they're saying. They will say literally anything, doesn't matter how bad it is, because they want this revenge so much. At least that's my interpretation of it anyway.
Yeah, it really shows the blindness of rage and the misguided nature of revenge. And also ironic, really, because the other controversial scene in Irreversible, the one that involves a man being beaten to death with a fire extinguisher by Pierre, ironically,
Yeah,
Pierre
that's the thing, yeah.
is actually the one who is, kind of meant to be, he's a bit of a beta male, isn't he? He's a bit of a kind of all talk and no
He's kind of
action.
Like a bit weak, sort of pseudo-intellectual man who's sort of, trying to get back with his ex-girlfriend in like this really underhanded way at a party. And he's like, literally there's about 20 minutes of the film where the revenge sort of build up is happening, where he's saying to Marcus, no, don't do this. What are you doing? Go to the hospital. That's that literally for about 20 minutes. It's kind of funny in a way. And yeah, you're right. He's the one who actually, because what happens, and it's hard to, even if you've seen the film, it's actually hard to make out, because the scenes at the Rectum Club are deliberately filmed in a very disorientating way. Like lots of swirling camera work, and it's dark as well, and I think some of that's to hide kind of some of the sexual activity kind of going on at this club. It sort of portrays kind of a very Sardian, shall we say, kind of atmosphere at this club, Le Rectum, where
excellent pronunciation.
Merci beaucoup. Mange tu, Rodney. So Marcus he thinks he's found this guy Letenier, and he gets in a fight with this random guy, it turns out, and he gets his arm broken. He's going to get raped in this club, just openly, like in front of all these men. And yeah, it's through Pierre who saves him from getting kind of the same fate that his girlfriend got, but at the same time, he bashes the shit out of this guy's head with a fire extinguisher in its excruciating detail. And it's CGI, so it's not like you're watching a Lucio Fulci film, for example. You're not seeing like some like polystyrene model of a man's head getting slowly kind of bashed in. It's done quite well, actually.
Well,
I would say 2002 CGI.
Both the fire extinguisher scene and the rape scene included CGI. So actually, the assailant's penis in the rape scene was CGI'd on.
Yeah, exactly. So knowing that.
Well, coming back to the realism aspect of it, I remember discussing this film with a friend of mine who went through a period of watching a lot of real death videos online.
We all know one of those.
We all know one of those. And yeah, it's like one of those dark corners of the internet kind of thing. You know, like there are websites where, you know, you can watch real life death videos that are uploaded by users all over the world, really grim stuff. And he actually said that the rape scene, like he knew that was fake. Like he knew Monica Bellucci was not actually being brutalized for real. But with the fire extinguisher scene, that looked real. Like that looked realistic. And I'm just thinking like, yeah, he would know based on his visual experience there. But that's something interesting, I feel like that's the scene that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much.
Yeah, it kind of pays very close second to the rape scene for obvious reasons. The rape scene is kind of the sort of centerpiece of the movie, but yeah, the fire
selling
extinguisher
point
scene, yeah, if you want to call it that, yeah. But yeah, the scene with the fire extinguisher is so brutal. And what makes it is not necessarily just the visuals of it, although the visuals are really, really fucked up. It's the sound design
the
as
sound
well.
design is really just out of this world.
Oh, it's just, oh my god, it's just the sound of metal on bone and flesh is just.
Also, there's a kind of, it's quite difficult to describe it. It's like almost like a turbine effect, or like a helicopter or something, or you know, when the sound goes nearer and then farther, you know, when it's kind of going.
Yes, I know what you mean. It's like,
yeah, exactly. That's I
yeah.
found that very, very difficult. Personally, watching it with sort of surround headphones, really. On a big flat screen TV, I found like that kind of immersive experience of it like a lot more difficult than when I just sort of watched it on my laptop with my laptop speakers in the early 2010s. You know, it didn't really have the same effect.
No, I can't imagine why. Yeah. Okay, so I suppose we've kind of talked around it a lot and we sort of just mentioned it. So you've got the scene with the fire extinguisher. That is a brutal scene in and of itself, but the scene that everyone talks about when it comes to Irreversible is the 9-minute long rape scene of Monica Bellucci by Latinia in an underpass. And from my perspective, before I kind of ask Miro kind of what you think about it, so there's, how do I put this in the nicest way possible? It's not the first rape scene I've ever seen in my life. So when it comes to these rape revenge films, there's sort of three that are really good. There's Irreversible, there's Miss 45 by Abel Ferrara, which is really good, and the rape scenes in that are not actually that upsetting. They're kind of quite short and they're not sort of horrible, if that makes sense. And it's just a really, really cool film, and I love Abel Ferrara. So that's the one that I always tell people to watch if you want to watch a rape revenge film that isn't going to make you want to have a shower afterwards. And then the main one is obviously I Spit on Your Grave. Now, the original I Spit on Your Grave is very, very hard to watch. It's very... Although Miyazaki, the director, he didn't intend for it to be like this really, really upsetting film. He made it because he knew someone who had this experience happen to them, and he wanted to make a film that was original title was Day of the Woman. So, you know, he wanted to make this movie that was about empowering women, for God's sake. But he, made this film with 3 different rape scenes in it. In the middle, it's about 30 minutes in total of these different rape scenes, and it's not just one guy like Irreversible, it's multiple guys. And unfortunately, it is very difficult to watch, even now, for a film that's like over 40 years old. Irreversible's a bit different, though. So, for a start, it's, I believe, an unbroken single take. And the camera starts and it's following Monica Bellucci as she leaves this flat or this apartment, whatever. And then it's sort of just because the central theme of the film is time destroys everything, and it's just this, the film is almost about chance and kind of like if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, kind of all this really fucked up shit happens to you. So she wants to get a taxi, she can't get a taxi. I think one drives past from what I remember. And then this passerby just says, oh, you should go down the underpass because it's quicker. And so she goes down the underpass, and the underpass is obviously a very deliberate visual metaphor for what is about to happen to her. And the underpass is coloured in like this red light as well, which is deliberate because red is not only the colour of love, it's also the colour of blood, it's the colour of violence as well. And then she kind of, without meaning to, kind of finds herself, passing this pimp who's having a physical argument with one of his I'm trying to think of the right word, perps, shall we say. I think that's what they're called. And yeah, she then the rape scene happens, which is done with a total stationary camera shot. It's very Michael Haneke, I would say, because it's the kind of thing that Haneke would do, where the camera, it's not very close up to Monica Bellucci's face and the actor playing Latanya, his face either, but it's still fairly close up, and you can see and you can really hear like her screams. Very, very distress. Seeing it, not a lot actually happens. It's more listening to it is very, very distressing. But the worst part to me is in the background, about 2 or 3 minutes into this rape, you see a character walk into shot and then kind of turn around and walk away, which is very, very distressing. So it's like someone could have helped and chose not to because they didn't want to get involved. I don't know if that's another character in the film or not, or if it is literally just a random passerby. I'm not 100% sure.
I think it's probably a random passerby. There's nothing to suggest that it was anyone that we saw before or will see before chronologically.
Yeah. I thought it could have been one of the heavy guys who what was trying to say, oh, let's get this guy, don't trust the police. I thought it might have been one of them. And that was kind of why they kind of knew to be in the area when that was going on. But I think you're right. I think it is literally just some random person who's not involved with the story. And then not only is she raped, obviously, she's then very, very physically, violently beaten afterwards. Not only sort of kicked a couple of times, punched in the face several times, and then her verbally head smashed into the floor.
Verbally assaulted.
And the verbals as well.
And the verbals, a lot of them, I was surprised by how prevalent, there was a sense of class hatred.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that really comes across in Noé's first 2 films that we mentioned, Carne and I Stand Alone. And obviously, having the butcher appear at the start of the film, it kind of reminds us of that rhetoric, kind of class hatred, of Monica Bellucci evidently being a representative of, the bourgeoisie, and she's getting what's coming to her, in this completely unfathomable, violent way. Also quite misogynistic rhetoric as well. We know that this guy is he's gay, and that he's running transvestite prostitutes as a pimp. And so just the added horror of that as well. It's difficult to watch. It's difficult to talk about as well, actually. It gives you I don't know, talking about it now gives me quite visceral, kind of quite physical reaction. It puts me almost, back in the shot. It's something that really kind of sears itself onto your eyeballs, watching. I was surprised. I've only seen it twice, as I mentioned, once in the early 2010s and once in anticipation of this. And I was surprised at how well I remembered, everything. I was able to understand a lot more of the dialogue watching it with subtitles this time. But in terms of the visuals and the sequence, I remembered it very, very well. It's certainly not a film that's easy to forget once you've seen it.
No, definitely. I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. I just want to quickly ask because obviously a film like this, there's two ways you can look at it. And this is why I haven't really gone into the whole reviews of the Outer Rim thing on this episode, because from reading reviews, there are kind of two different schools of thought. There's either this film is amazing, it's a technical masterpiece, and that's even people who say it's a technical masterpiece, but I would never watch it again and it's horrible. And then you got people who are outraged, for lack of a better term, and they're like, this is horrible for this reason, and it's like, oh, Monica Bellucci gets raped for 10 minutes, and isn't this terrible? Which I'm just not a fan of kind of like outrage culture. It's like, it's not as black and white as that. But there was something I read and I thought, I don't think I can talk about this with any authority for obvious reasons, as will become clear. But there was a reviewer on Letterboxd who said something to the effect of that Monica Bellucci's character only really serves a purpose to the film as sort of motivation for Marcus and Pierre to get revenge. So her character is almost like a plot device. Like, she isn't really a fully formed person in that sense. Like, it's a man's film.
I don't agree with that.
Right, okay. Let me see if I can find the review. So why is it that you don't agree?
I think she's a fully rounded character. Not just in the way that she's scripted. Like there's a very human element to her. The fact that she is a young woman who's in a relationship, who is overjoyed at the news of her pregnancy, and who's reading this book that has a strange resonance for her, and that resonance in fact is this horrible presentiment of this life-changing extreme trauma. Even if you didn't see her on screen or hear kind of the improvised dialogue, I think she's still a very a compelling character that you empathize with, just by virtue of those quite basic facts. And birth and infants, conception, I would say conception and birth, childhood, that's a trope that runs through all of Noé's films. That's something that he is very concerned with, and it's certainly no accident that the poster that he chooses to display on the apartment of Marcus and
2001.
2001, A Space Odyssey, the ultimate trip with the new species
Star
being
Child.
born, the Star Child. Yeah, that to him is a very powerful image, and watching Love with that in mind this time, I found it a lot more symbolic and a lot more moving as well. Because he is concerned, with the mystery of conception and birth, and of almost the random, sometimes violent, sometimes involuntary way in which souls are thrust into the realm of the living. So she's certainly not a plot device. No, she's a central character, and a strong central character at that.
Okay, let me read the part of the review because it will probably contextualize this a bit better. So I've tried to take out some of the more emotive stuff in this review. So it's a review from the Outer Rim that I didn't say I was going to do, but never mind. It's by a user called Ash, who gave it 2 stars out of 5. And this part of the review says, "What really ruins this film for me is the aftermath of the rape and how it is depicted through the eyes of not the now comatose victim. This feels like a cheap shot to get out of actually exploring the rape beyond it just being a plot device, but of her boyfriend and her best friend. Noe frames this story of sexual violence against a woman as a male story, and I honestly am disgusted by it. All Noe and his characters care about is being called a fag. There is a particular scene in which Pierre tells Marcus he didn't even have a quarter of the energy for Alex after she is raped, as he does defending himself against homophobic slurs. Alex declaring she is her own person does not work as foreshadowing, it just comes off as cruel. Alex is shown naked repeatedly, her only value coming in the form of her naked body and when or how it can serve a man. Her best friend talks non-stop about how they used to fuck, as if that was the only aspect of their relationship, the only one worth mentioning. Not once does Noe even attempt to understand how an event like this might impact on a woman, not even through backwards foreshadowing. It is simply a turning point in a man's story. I think this person misunderstands the film.
I think that Noe is aware of the fact that he's playing with fire. I think he intends to provoke, but he intends to do so much more than provoke. You know, he uses provocation to challenge the desensitized viewer into, you know, grappling with these life and death issues. It's not merely a shock tactic. You know, it's consciously selected range of stylistic devices and narrative devices as well. Like certainly with regards to the reverse chronology, he lifts the revenge narrative from the familiar and makes something very artful of it, which sort of challenges us as a viewer. But I think he's no stranger to bad reviews and generally being criticized and in many ways shunned for doing things the way he does and for tackling the sort of topics that he tackles. I was quite surprised by how well received across the board Climax was.
Yeah, it got a lot of really, really good reviews. I was shocked too. I thought it was Gaspar Noé, so people are going to dismiss it straight away. But no, it generally was received really well.
And I wonder what it is. I wonder if it's because it's, in a way, more stylized than many of his other films.
I think it could be that, or it could be that although shocking things do happen in the film, it's not a case of how in his earlier films, for example, were like, oh, you know, something really, really disturbing that's going to piss you off is going to happen. Like, you know, oh, you can get out the cinema now if you want. Or with something like Irreversible, kind of like how, although it's not like I Stand Alone with like a warning or anything like that, people kind of knew what they were getting into. I think with Enter the Void and Love, it's less about violence. It's more about kind of, it's less misanthropic and less violent, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in Climax he's maybe a little less self-conscious in a way.
Yeah, apart from literally right at the start of the film. I think that's about as self-conscious as he gets in the film. You can't get any more self-conscious than that.
Irreversible is a very confident film, and it's the product of a very mature vision. I was quite surprised watching, as I've said, his first two films at how fully formed his voice is, even at such an early juncture in his career.
Yeah, I would say so. And it's at this point in the show, because we're coming up to the end now of our journey into the world of Gaspar Noé, and this is going to be an interesting question. So, Irreversible, how bad is it? So, is it a good date movie? Is it not that bad? Bad? Very bad? Or the worst? And Miro, I'll leave this one to you to start off with.
I think it's a very bad date movie.
I agree. I would say it's not the worst because the film is very, very well made and I think it has artistic merit. And even though, yeah, the two things that happen in the film are horrific, It's not like the whole film is like wall-to-wall nihilism or wall-to-wall like just horrible content. There are films that are, believe it or not, there are actually films that are out there that are worse than this in terms of having violent content in it and just really hateful content. But I would definitely not watch this on a date. This would be a horrendous film to watch on a date with anyone, whatever your sexuality. Just, yeah, it's very bad. For the rape scene alone, I would have to say it's a very bad date movie, but not the worst.
Agreed. Fully agreed. Having said that, I think as far as Gaspar Noé films go, this is the worst date movie.
Ooh, yeah, I would say so. It's the most kind of shocking in terms of like incident, just purely for the rape scene. I would say I Stand Alone is very, very misanthropic, but apart from where he kind of, well, he punches his pregnant mistress in the stomach, to try and get her to have an abortion, and there's obviously themes of incest and stuff in there as well, it still doesn't even hold a candle to 9 minutes of basically rape. So
no,
yeah,
and it
I would
ends
say
on
you
a
are correct.
strangely optimistic note. I Stand Alone.
As does Irreversible, weirdly.
All in all, I think that Gaspar Noé is a compassionate and morally responsible filmmaker.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, if you want to watch this, then it is quite widely available. It's available from Canal Plus or Studio Canal, whatever their kind of DVD wing is. So yeah, if you want to check it out, because it's very good. And in fact, any of Noé's films I would recommend, as would Miro, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Go educate yourselves. Watch them all.
Watch them all. And if you're a fan of French extreme cinema from the 2000s, then you'll want to check out the next show, because the film I'm talking about is really, really fucked up. It's one that's been requested before. Not going to spoil it, but I don't think you guys are going to be disappointed. So yeah, if you think Irreversible is a bad date movie, then you will also agree the next film I'm going to talk about is a bad date movie as well. So check out the next show for that one. I want to thank Myroslava Hartmond once again for joining me on one of these very, very bad date movie shows.
Thank you. This episode has been a noble challenge for me.
Yeah, I totally understand. Yeah. God, I think it'd be a challenge for most people. But yeah, I want to thank you very much for stepping up to the plate and handling some Noé, shall we say. And I'll see you again very soon, I'm sure. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed our descent into the world of Gaspar Noé, a Sardian kind of descent into the world, it must be said, but a descent nonetheless. And I hope you came out the other side a better person for it. I thank you very much. Thank you for listening. If you want to follow me on social media, you can at Worst Date Movies Ever. And don't forget to click subscribe wherever you're listening to this right now to never miss another episode of Worst Date Movies Ever.